Last time on Ikkin Investigates, we considered the definition of Gnosticism, its connection to the figure of Prometheus, and Final Fantasy XV's suspicion of its own Promethean figures. The time has come, then, to begin analyzing Dawn of the Future in earnest. By all meaningful metrics, Dawn of the Future is Ardyn's story. The novel begins with a massive expansion of his backstory, much of which was adopted into game canon. He is the only character who plays a meaningful role in all 4 chapters, and it is his action, ostensibly in defying the gods, that forced the game's original narrative off rails and flung its heroes into a brave new world where obedience to one's divine vocation has mutated from the key to the world's salvation to a threat to humanity's survival. One particularly fascinating aspect of Ardyn's development in Dawn of the Future is that, shorn of its intended context, the novel's depiction of his downfall meshes perfectly with the game's suspicion of the Promethean archetype. To be sure, the novel presents him as a true benefactor. Its Luna describes him as the very picture of a savior. Its Noctis describes him as utterly selfless. To judge purely by what the narration says about him, he's every bit the Christ figure that his visual depiction implies. Unfortunately, Ardyn suffers from 2 fatal flaws that ensure that his tenderness is exactly the sort inclined to degenerate into mass murder. In spite of the novel's best efforts to present him as an unfairly persecuted innocent, his misery requires no interference by capricious deities. When considered in isolation, the entire sordid affair is nothing more than the natural consequence of idealism gone wrong. Ardyn's primary flaw, moreover, is an especially Gnostic one. He suppresses an essential element of reality in order to be able to construct an image of the world to suit his desires. He is manifestly unwilling to accept the critical problems that render his intended means of salvation futile. While Somnus may be presented as a villain, his characterization of the matter is entirely correct. Ardyn lacks the ability to see the world for what it is. His excessive trust in the world keeps him blind to its less desirable truths. He is ill fit to rule a country because, to stand strong, a nation must be grounded in reality. Unfortunately, while Lucis was spared Ardyn's rule, his failure to remain grounded in reality brought about consequences as disastrous as any that may have followed had he been crowned king. By refusing to recognize the reality that absorbing the Star Scourge, one afflicted individual at a time, could not possibly bring it to an end, or that attempting to do so would guarantee the loss of his own mind and body, he doomed himself to be ravaged by the Scourge, rejected by the Crystal, erased from Lucian history, and imprisoned in the island of Angelgard. Whether or not the gods used his misfortune as a means to spawn a monster fit for sacrifice, the monster he became remains the natural consequence of his own actions. No cunning cruelty far beyond that of mortal minds required. Ardyn's second fatal flaw is born from this capital sin. Ardyn is incapable of true selflessness due to his inability to differentiate between his own will and the will of the gods, even when the 2 are clearly at odds. Consider Ardyn's motivation for healing. He insists that each of the lives that had fallen to the Scourge were meant to know love one day, that in fact romantic love is an irrevocable right of life, and that the purpose of his powers was to see that no one lost their chance to know love. This is frankly delusional. No one sufficiently familiar with reality could claim that human beings have an irrevocable natural right to a romantic partner. But Ardyn has convinced himself that this delusion is in fact the will of the gods. Ardyn's inability to acknowledge the likely results of his actions likewise causes him to insist on doing good on his own terms. Having suppressed his awareness of his inevitable demonic transformation, he remained unwilling to lay down his life without struggle or fight, even if doing so might have been the most effective means of bringing an end to the Scourge. In other words, Ardyn's understanding of the will of the gods is virtually indistinguishable from a mirror. It is only natural, then, that he should leap so readily from claiming that the will of the gods must not be questioned, to despairing that the gods have abandoned us, and seeking to destroy the divine order when his own plans were dashed. Failure inevitably crushes the faith and undermines the trust of those who cannot distinguish between their own will and that of the gods. And in the absence of faith, one of the most telling things about Dawn of the Future, then, is that Ardyn is the only character whose desires are completely satisfied. In Final Fantasy XV, Noctis initially wishes to avoid responsibility, but he eventually learns to accept it even at the cost of his life. In Dawn of the Future, he makes a lateral shift and decides he must instead render all sacrifice unnecessary, despite the fact that someone who has supposedly experienced all of human history really ought to know better. By the novel's end, he's rewarded with an entire world to rebuild, no solid path to tread, and the knowledge that his method of saving the world got one of Luna's closest friends killed? Whoops. To make matters worse, his attempt to make sacrifice obsolete is a farce given that death remains, as ever, inevitable. In Final Fantasy XV, Luna's motivations are very consistent. From her first moment on screen to her last, she's committed to doing the will of the gods. In Dawn of the Future, her faith is shaken, but her motivations remain largely the same. Even after Bahamut's betrayal, she still seeks to follow Gentiana's will. The novel ultimately rewards her for this by having her awaken from a second death to find that Gentiana's plan failed and saving the world ultimately cost the lives of the gods she had spent her life serving. In Final Fantasy XV, Aranea begins as a mercenary motivated by money, but ultimately chooses a less selfish path and seeks to protect whoever she can. In Dawn of the Future, she mostly just wants to sleep. And in the end, she's rewarded by being unceremoniously sent off as Soul's backup to help evacuate a city whose people, incidentally, are only mostly spared. Ardyn's desires, in contrast, are completely satisfied, albeit not in the way he expected. In both Final Fantasy XV and Dawn of the Future, he wants to end the line of Lucis, destroy the ring and the crystal, and subject the gods to a humiliating death, and in the end, he receives everything he asked for and more. He hadn't even thought to seek an apology from Somnus or consolation from Era while passing into non-existence, but the novel saw fit to reward him with both over and above the destruction of everything associated with the Divine Order. Why then does Dawn of the Future bestow such largesse on a homicidal, deicidal madman? On the surface, this is a bizarre move to make. Ardyn's hatred and rage are aggressively unpleasant, and he's literally given free rein to torture the player. With that said, Ardyn always received a great deal of sympathy from the audience, and fans' desire to see him vindicated long predated Dawn of the Future. Overthrowing gods who allow well-intentioned mass murderers to suffer must possess some appeal. And here is where Vogelin's exploration of Gnosticism can offer further insight. Vogelin explains that Gnostics, much like Ardyn, begin with an error in thinking. On the surface lies the deception itself. It could be self-deception, and very often is. But eventually the self-deception fails. The thinker becomes aware of the untruth of his assertion or speculation, but persists in it in spite of this knowledge. In the end, the revolt against God is revealed and recognized to be the motive for this rejection of truth. How many in our own modern world accept things they can't possibly believe to be true in pursuit of some utopian fantasy? How many feel compelled to justify Ardyn's self-deception in their unwillingness to confront their own? Ardyn's story ought to demonstrate that there's no faster way to hell than to attempt to create heaven. But why wouldn't those who believe that they're called to create heaven identify with a character who explicitly rebels against divine order and root for his success? Ardyn may be the most important character in Dawn of the Future, but he's not the only one whose connection to Gnosticism requires a full video's worth of exploration. The novel actually sees fit to introduce an original character to better serve its Gnostic ends. But for now, discussion of Soul must wait. Until next time, on Ikkin Investigates.